Today, I will be talking about trauma and happiness with Heather Mason, the founder of the Minded Institute, the founder of the Yoga and Healthcare Alliance, and the Secretariat of All Party Parliamentary Group on Yoga. She's based in London, originally from America. I'm so happy to have you here, Heather. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicoletta. I'm really pleased to be chatting with you today.
You're very welcome. So, we're going to explore relational trauma and happiness today with you, Heather. And we're going to look at this from the perspective of your life and work experience. Would you like to share with us how was your journey in life so far and how you arrived at this junction where you created the Minded Institute and all of the other beautiful projects that you're running right now?
So there's so many different things that led up to my creation of the Minded Institute, which was very much an organic process. I did not have in mind that I would create a yoga therapy school or that I would do any of the other things. I grew up in Manhattan. I am and Long Island, which are both in New York. I had a lot of developmental trauma, and I actually studied at the University of Hawaii for my undergraduate education, which was a liberation from the life that I had grown up in. But upon graduation, I returned back to New York, and a lot of the factors which were previously there leading to problems with my well being, which is why I left in the first place, reemerged. And after 10 months there, I decided that I was going to leave. I had two undergraduate degrees. One was in anthropology, and under the guise of traveling around the world in order to study another culture, I left and I started in Asia. And very soon into that journey, I ended up in Buddhist monasteries. It just kept happening. And I know it sounds like, how could that just happen? How could you just end up in a Buddhist monastery? But I would just be somewhere and somebody would bring me, and then the abbot would ask me to stay. And these things kept happening over and over. It did feel very much like a fated experience. And over the period of 2000 to 2003, I lived in Buddhist monasteries and ashrams on and off in Southeast Asia in order to transform my mind from the inside out. And that included practicing intense mindfulness and other types of meditation from the Buddhist tradition and yoga practice, which actually I had learned earlier. But as an ex gymnast, until I was involved in deep meditation within the Buddhist tradition, I really didn't understand yoga. And I thought it was just another way of doing gymnastics as an adult person rather than as a young person and a teenager. So it took Buddhism to clarify what yoga actually was. And I thought that I would actually become a Buddhist nun. And I ended up in the UK doing a master's degree in Buddhist studies at SOAS University London. And in that degree, I realized that I actually wanted to live in the world and that I didn't want to be living in the monastery at that time, although it is regularly something I reconsider. And all of that led to many other things. I started teaching yoga full time in Taiwan amongst doing other jobs living there. So obviously, I had to leave the UK. I was living in Taiwan for some time. And when I came back to the UK, I wasn't really sure what to do. Unless you want to be in academia, there's not much you can do with a master's degree in Buddhist studies. So I trained to be a psychotherapist at the Karuna Institute. And 2 years into that program, I felt that I didn't want to use talking therapy as the primary modality to help other people because it hadn't been mine. And so I trained as a yoga therapist. And I actually should note that in from 2000 and 2000 to 2003, I already had trained as a yoga teacher while I was living in Asia. And when I lived in Taiwan, I was teaching yoga. Um, and when I did that training in 2007, which I did in India, I took sabbatical from my psychotherapy program for a period of time. It dawned on me that there were things that we could do through movement and breath that could change the way that the brain functioned. And that maybe it could be more expedient for people to come out of some of the trauma of their life and to come out of some of the depression, anxiety, etc., through possibly a easier road than the one I had taken, which was to sit through my mind in silence for, like, without exaggeration, sometimes 16 hours a day, every waking hour, um, except when you were eating. And then you were actually doing meditation as well in some of the monasteries in Thailand and Southeast Asia. And because I wanted to have a clear understanding of how yoga impacted these different things, I then did a master's in neuroscience. And to the best of my knowledge at that time, I was the only person in the UK really looking at how movement was going to impact brain functioning. So my business started to kind of really take off. So I wasn't able to complete that degree, although I did the vast majority of it. And in addition, I think it was sort of the beginning of that degree. I had developed an 8-week course for depression and anxiety. That was before the degree, but I had a student in one of the classes that asked me to train with the Boston Trauma Center in Boston around PTSD and yoga. And at that time in 2008, nobody had done that yet in this country. So I really had very little knowledge of what trauma was, to be honest. It was only after that training that I was to understand that for so many years I had suffered from PTSD. It was like looking backwards upon my life through a lens. Yes. So I'm
Wow.
very grateful to that student. And I went there. I trained in yoga for trauma with the Boston Trauma Center. And I then started working at the traumatic stress service at the Maudsley. Again, to the best of my knowledge, is the first person doing that in the UK. And that was illuminating for me. And then I started to put the brain pieces together. Like, okay, how does how does PTSD show up in the brain? And how does yoga change the brain? And how can we link these two together? And Bessel van der Kolk had given a lecture at the training that I did, and I was really taken with that. So I wanted to follow that route more and more and more deeply. And given that I was doing an MSc in neuroscience, I truly had that opportunity. Um, the Minded Institute was created not long after that because people started to want to train in the methods that I was offering. Again, it wasn't something that I thought in advance, oh, I want to create this thing. It was on request. And originally, it was just a program for people who wanted to use yoga therapy for mental health conditions. And the following year, it immediately opened up into broader things, including other lifestyle conditions and anatomical musculoskeletal issues. And it would be a few years until I would found the Yoga and Healthcare Alliance with the vision of integrating yoga into healthcare. And that's primarily led now by the CEO, Paul Fox, although I founded it. And also before I would go back to the United States and live between Boston and London for 3 years, where I taught at a medical school and was trying to influence future doctors' perceptions of health, and then returned to the UK and did another MSc in medical physiology because I wanted to understand different systems. In fact, if I could have gone to medical school, that would have been my preference. But I was super busy. And an MSc you can do in just over a year, medical school you cannot.
Yeah.
I still want to go to medical school. And, many other things arose from that, including helping to set up the all-party parliamentary group on yoga in society with some of the parliamentarians and acting as the secretariat. So I guess that's kind of my journey. And the question about trauma and happiness, which I guess is part of what this podcast focuses on, I don't think that you ever arrive at a life that's sort of exactly what you envision for yourself. But I think through mind body practice, you become maybe more competent at managing your own moods and regulating, which allows life to be more pleasurable and gives rise to the energy to create that which you would like, which is challenging if you're always in a state of overwhelmed, psychologically flooded or frozen.
So beautiful. I mean, your life journey is very interesting. Living in different continents, experiencing different cultures. So lovely to have the opportunity to be exposed to such diversity, human diversity, cultural diversity, and to train so much. I thought I've been studying a lot throughout my life, but you've definitely have done that much more, and it's amazing It feels like you have a strong desire to learn more, to understand more, and to share this knowledge with the others. Can I just ask, before discovering Buddhist monasteries and being involved with the life in Asia, understanding the Eastern spirituality traditions, what was your relationship with happiness prior to that? And how has that changed as a result of actually being initiated in Buddhism and different other philosophies of mind or religions, whatever we want to call them, that look at life from a kind of a different perspective comparing to the Western world?
Well, the first thing I would say is that my relationship to happiness was it was very, very far away. So my relationship was I was here and it was on the other side of the planet. Essentially, I was extremely miserable. But I think what you're asking is sort of a philosophical point, not just was I happy and am I happy now? You know, the biggest and most important teaching I think that both yoga and Buddhism offer is they clarify that happiness is based upon what you're experiencing within yourself as opposed to external conditions, which places the onus of happiness on the individual. And that's both very empowering and very, very difficult. Because if you have experienced severe trauma in your life, and it has led to your nervous system and your entire physiological system, your mind being dysregulated, and you have to own the fact that your happiness is your responsibility when the way that your mind body was created was far from ideal. It's pretty difficult to accept that. But that is the inherent teachings of both of these traditions, and I did find that incredibly useful. It does require taking away the sense of external blame from what has happened. But I think uniquely when we're talking about trauma as opposed to just happiness as a result of depressed mood, we also need to realize that the external phenomenon that did occur definitely made it harder to connect to that aspect of ourselves and to have the internal fortitude and neurological architecture to come to that realization. And there's a whole process that needs to happen before. But I guess my relationship is the understanding that no matter how much it seems like it's the external world that is leading to my suffering when it does arise, is that it is me creating it.
That's very interesting. It will be a little bit challenging for most people to really comprehend this, but I'm starting to understand that myself because at the end of the day, we live in an internal world and an external world, and it's up to us how we manage this inner space, which is probably the only bit that we can control. We might be able to influence a little bit the external world, but not to such degree that we can completely change the world. So I can understand that. So now you're going through a lot of wisdom, and you practice meditation yourself. You go through all of these teachings, and I would imagine something is shifting inside of you. If we can maybe explore a little bit, what have you learned throughout these Buddhist teachings that is so essential to navigating hardship and still making ourselves available for happiness? Because this is where we struggle, really. We can't really sustain a level of inner peace all the time because there's a lot of noise outside, and life is unfolding and it goes, in different directions. So how can we move through hardship and pain and still retain that sense of self-regulation or inner balance, come back home into that place where we make a choice how we're feeling inside?
I mean, that's a vast question. And just to go back to what I said before and your response, I just want to make sure that I'm not invalidating for anybody that if they have had trauma in their lives, that wholeheartedly has led to their suffering. It's just that the mental reliving of that process internally is happening within oneself. And whatever happened externally is making it so much harder for a person to arrive at the place that they are the creators of their own reality and happiness. But at the same time, there's definitely those real external factors that may have been absolutely horrific. And I really want to validate that.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of what the teaching offers, I think, first of all, whether we're talking about yoga or mindfulness meditation, we're talking about some level of cultivation. I think specifically when we're discussing yoga, what it provides is the ability to move through changes in the autonomic nervous system that will be necessary for anybody that has experienced trauma to allow for the regulation to recognize my mind. I'm sitting here and actually no external event is happening right now, but my mind is eating me alive and I'm really suffering. And in order to calm oneself down in such a moment. Now, through practices such as breath work, particularly slow breathing practices with the elongation of the exhalation, you are supporting the cultivation of the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, which is that kind of rest and digest aspect of the nervous system that tends to be undertoned for people with PTSD. And you're reducing the hyperactivity of the fight, flight, sympathetic activity. And when you do that through slow controlled movement and slow controlled breathing over and over and over again, right? This is not a fast process. This is not like a magic pill. The brain, the nervous system, and the other physiological systems, they start to change. And when they change, suddenly how you see reality shifts as well, because the mind and the brain co-arise. We could get into a deep philosophical conversation about it, whether they're actually separate or they're the same thing. And that's been something that philosophers have been arguing about for a long time, and scientists. But regardless, they co-arise. So once you change the nature of your nervous system, you will change the nature of reality. And one of the things that seems to happen for almost everybody that goes along these spiritual paths is the realization that there is no such thing as enduring happiness, that what you can have is continuous equanimity and contentment by being able to manage the vicissitudes of life and how the mind responds, and not going like this every time something is difficult or something makes us feel triggered or like we're not good enough. And instead, just being able to actually step back and say, this is just a mental process and I'm okay. And I think that's really what these practices offer. And I have been, in all of my years in working with people, really focused on making sure that people do not attach to the idea that they're always going to feel okay if they do these practices, because that's not reality. The real wellness is the ability to know that external circumstances will always change, that life will have hardship, and that by cultivating the ability to be equanimous through the different vicissitudes of life, one will be more well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very well articulated. Because it's really unrealistic to imagine that you're going through life and there will be no shaking, there will be no adversity whatsoever. And it becomes quite a reality to me now, working with so many people across different cultures and age groups and genders and whatever differences we might want to discuss about. It's coming very clear to me that irrespective of who we are, where we are, where we live in our first years of life, naturally we experience a little bit of adversity, at least one incident or maybe more. But there is a lot of abuse going on, verbal abuse, this, emotional abuse within the family environment. There's parents going their own way, trapped in their own drama. There's addiction, there's depression, other mental illness within the family environment that naturally has an impact on us as children. And of course, it remains there, even if we suppress it or repress it, or we don't engage with the pain and the suffering. In time, it becomes, part of us, and it stops us, it blocks us to move forward, to reach that level of contentment and inner peace that we would want to achieve. Now, in my experience, all trauma is relational. Everything that really hurts us happens in one of the relationship circles, whether we hurt ourselves or others hurt us. It's just the nature of life. And I'm also learning, and I'm writing about this in my book, that trauma is transgenerational. It doesn't really start with us. The people that actually traumatize us have been traumatized themselves. So from the perspective of relational trauma, I'd like to explore this with you, Heather. How do you work with this type of life challenge? What's been your learning so far around that in terms of impact, and what can we do about it?
Are you asking me how I, as an individual, deal with the relational trauma of my life? Or are you asking me how I help other people to manage what's arising for them? I'm not sure I understand.
Yes, I'm asking you as a professional. Yeah.
I think it's really going to be the same kind of answer. I mean, so some of your viewers will be familiar with the work of Stephen Porges,
Yes.
right? Polyvagal theory. But I'll just briefly review the aspects that I think are relevant to the work that I do. So Stephen Porges came up with the idea of polyvagal theory, which is that the vagus, the primary nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system, which I already mentioned, rest and digest. It has, first of all, two branches, the ventral vagal and the dorsal vagal. And the ventral vagal is evolutionarily more recent. And the ventral vagal branch forms part of what we call the social engagement system. And by the way, the ventral vagal branch, the myelination of this happens last in the autonomic nervous system. And just to explain what myelination is, this is white matter being placed around the axons of the neurons that make up the nerve. So it's really what we're talking about is white matter. And myelination is really important within individual neurons and within nerves because it speeds the flow of transmission. So it makes any kind of pathway more effective. Now, because this is the last part of the autonomic nervous system to develop and very much develops in relationship to the kind of care and support we have at the earliest stages of life, if we don't have that, this myelination is not going to be of the same level. We often will say that we have reduced vagal tone, and that is going to therefore affect what I just noted, which is the social engagement network. And what the vagus does in relationship to the social engagement network is, first of all, it connects to our larynx, so it allows us to modulate our voice so that I can show great excitement and bond with somebody else, or great sadness in my voice, like, I'm so sorry that happened, which connects through empathetic understanding. It actually allows the tightening of a muscle in the middle ear so that I can more effectively listen to the person in front of me. And it allows more facial movement, as well as reducing sympathetic drive so that when I'm connecting with somebody else, I'm not frightened. And one of the things that the practices of yoga and mindfulness offer people with trauma, in addition to, this graduated reconnection to the body, and when people have been dissociated, is that it supports the development of the ventral vagal network, therefore the social engagement network, allowing individuals to more effectively connect to other people organically. And this has been really important for me because over the years, part of my trauma was having severe social anxiety, like very, very severe. And I tried so many different techniques to feel less nervous connecting with another person. But through the practice of yoga and mindfulness, that organically arose. And although I didn't go and measure the vagal tone that I actually had, and it's an inferred measure if we are going to measure it, I'm pretty sure that that's actually what occurred. And so when you ask me what I do for other people, it's exactly the same thing. It's helping them to engage in practices that likely hone the vagal network, helping them just naturally to have this social engagement capacity rise. And that's one of the things that I love about the practice of yoga and
Mhm.
mindfulness. But I think that yoga with the breathing and the movement is probably a more expedient way to do this, and certainly easier.
Can you then maybe explain a bit for our listeners and watchers what is yoga therapy? How does it really work? And what do you do as a therapist yourself? How do you teach people to engage with this process? Can they do it themselves after they finish working with you? Is this a skill that you learn for life and you can keep for yourself to aid you on the way?
So, yoga therapy is the application of yoga practices and yogic philosophy to health conditions. And yoga therapists, in addition to either training as healthcare professionals first, usually mental health care, but not only, or yoga teachers need to do an additional 2 years plus of training. And the Minded Institute actually offers a diploma in this. And what yoga therapists do is they bring in all of the physiological medical knowledge. They're not doctors, but they do have a pretty broad understanding of the different conditions that they're working with, how yoga practices impact the psychophysiology of the individual, and then they align them. And they do that with also having a whole host of clinical skills that allow them to cultivate a therapeutic relationship with whoever is in front of them. And so when you would go to a yoga therapist with PTSD, you would first have an intake form, you would have an original session with your yoga therapist, and then the yoga therapist would take you through different practices that they felt would support you in having a certain level of transformation at the body, brain, mind level. And at the same time, be providing a certain level of therapeutic support where there is a sense of safety and a developing trust between you and the therapist, so that, like in a psychological therapy, that model could be taken from that relationship into the external world, which sort of makes yoga therapy unique as a therapy, in that you're working at the therapeutic relationship level to an extent, and at the same time you're using very particular practices that have specific kinds of effects, although they differ person to person. And yes, once you go to a yoga therapist for a period of time, you should be able to take away a bunch of the techniques and start working on your own. But like anything else, how long you're going to do that and how long you need to work with your yoga therapist in order to actually feel that you can stand on your own and have that personal agency is a case by case thing.
Mhm.
Most yoga therapists practice with a minimum of 6 sessions, and some of them will do years with an individual. It really depends on that person's need.
Yes. How is this changing your life? I mean, how has this changed your life comparing to where you were decades back when you started discovering yoga and discovering the Eastern traditions?
Well, as I said, it has led me to a different understanding of my mind, a transformation within my nervous system, the ability to help other people, which has imbued some of the challenges that I've had also in my life with meaning, rather than them just having been very difficult events that I wonder, why did this happen to me?
Mm. And this understanding of the past and this level of self-regulation, is this helping you be happier or more content or more at peace? Is this changing the way you relate with the others?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think also when you go through your own journey and come out the other side, you also have better other person perspective. So when things are not going your way, you may perceive that they also are struggling. And so it allows for a greater deal of patience. I'm not talking about traumatic incidences, I'm just talking about day to day living.
Mhm. Like different conflicts, relational conflicts, and different struggles in communication and so on.
Yeah, like for
Yeah.
example, right before this podcast, I dropped off my dog to get her summer haircut. And when I showed up, the woman was screaming at somebody else. And I really didn't want to leave my dog there because I love her very much. And I was nervous and I was quite irritated to show up to such a situation, to be honest. I don't think anybody wants to leave their animal with somebody else who's screaming. And I just took a moment and I said to her, I'm not sure that I feel really comfortable leaving Minnie, my dog, here at this moment. She's extremely precious to me. And rather than, what I wanted to do was just walk out and cancel the appointment immediately and just say, I'm not leaving her here. That was my immediate response, was to let her know that her behavior was having an impact on my position. And then I said, I can imagine that what's just happened is really stressful. And we had a bit of a conversation. She calmed down. She apologized. She gave Minnie a significant amount of attention. I think she needed a breather herself. And so I was able to leave Minnie there. Now, your viewers might think, well, why did you do that? It's not safe. But the thing is, I actually have a history with that woman. So I know she's not going to hurt my dog. And I think also I helped her to calm down because she was dealing with a very aggressive cat, and she actually came up with a scratch on her arm from, I think, some kind of dynamic with that cat.
Yes, yes. And these things are quite common, aren't they? We always somehow get into conflict situations and we tend to react. And probably that was a trauma response for her, wasn't it?
Yeah. Trauma response for just an aggressive one, but I think more importantly, it was for me how I responded. And I took a breath and I didn't respond because I'm extremely protective over my dog. And I too could have said, why are you screaming? Or the myriad of things that I felt when I walked in there to this situation.
Mm-hmm. So in this way, probably you managed to heal your own relational trauma, and now you're not reacting from a place of little consciousness, but you're fully aware of the importance of this moment, and you don't let yourself drag down into retaliating or reacting, but you take a minute to respond. And I think that space that you've created now for yourself is the result of years of practicing all of these tools that you mentioned. And I can see that naturally this is enhancing your life and it's helping others around you to become more aware themselves.
But I really want to highlight for your audience that I wouldn't say that I've healed my relational trauma. I think that a part of me in the past would have wanted to be able to come to a point in my life where I could say that. I think a lot of that has transformed. But this idea that I'm like completely well and that the experiences of the past haven't shaped who I am and mean that I may have certain proclivities to be more anxious than somebody else would not be true. And I think when I was peddled that earlier in my path, it was very damaging because I had an image that I was supposed to be completely psychologically well. And if I wasn't, I had failed. And so I don't want anybody listening to that to think that that's where they need to arrive. I think that they need to accept the conditions of their life have given risen to who they are now. And of course, to become better at interpersonal relationships, but not to be judgmental about some kind of idealized vision of themselves.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I too believe that you're never fully healed. And even if you would manage to reach a level of comfort, understanding, acceptance, surrendering to what was, and maybe even extracting some meaning from the pain that you've been through and learning some new ways of relating to others, and starting the process of healing and transforming how you interact with others. I don't think you're ever really fully healed. And even if the past is kind of behind, you're always challenged here and now, like you've been with the incident earlier on. And I think the response that you had is actually directly related to the level of transformation you've experienced as a human being. And we could say that maybe you have healed some of the injuries from the past, that you arrived now at a level where you could engage with that person from a place of awareness and compassion and understanding for her circumstances, rather than pushing each other's buttons and allowing the
Yes.
traumas to combine. So that's beautiful. Okay, Heather, it sounds so amazing. We're coming close towards the end of the podcast. I'd like to ask, what are your best three teachings that you captured through life and you would like to share with the people watching us and listening to us?
So I think the first is the practice of elongated Ujjayi exhalation. I don't know if you want me to demonstrate that for everybody, but every time we exhale, that nerve I talked about, the vagus, we further activate it. And every time we activate it, just like a muscle, we are at least theoretically enhancing the tone of it. And remember that nerve is associated with social engagement and parasympathetic response. So that's a really easy thing that people can do all the time. The more often you do it, the greater the effects. The next thing, I think loving kindness meditation can be extremely powerful. And that allows for some of the anger that generally is present in people that have experienced trauma, whether they're expressing it outwardly or not, to let go of, and to also potentially have some forgiveness by the people who did us wrong. As you said, most trauma is relational. There does need to be a point at which somebody actually feels comfortable with that, because in the beginning it can be very invalidating to try and send good wishes to somebody who's done something horrific to us. But that process usually involves doing a deep dive into who that person is and to what their history is likely to be. You mentioned transgenerational trauma, and trying to imagine the suffering that they may have undergone in order to have engaged in these kinds of deeply unkind acts. And then mindfulness. I think that actually being able to see the thought processes that occur helps to allow one to be less subject to them being the truth of reality, like, this will always happen to me, I am worthless, I will never be able to connect with people in a way that I'd like, I can't trust anybody, nobody's safe, and all of these thought processes that arise. There's a really interesting study actually that was recently published looking at the impact of mindfulness versus loving kindness on inflammatory markers for adults who had childhood adversity. And we already know that having childhood adversity can set us up for having greater levels of inflammation, which puts us at greater risk for many different diseases, not just psychological issues. So there's a real focus on how we might reduce that level of inflammation in adult populations. And I thought that the loving kindness meditation was going to show up as more powerful in reducing this inflammation. And they looked at a particular subset of genes called conserved transcription response to adversity. And really intriguingly, it was the mindfulness meditation that really reduced the activation of the expression of those genes associated with inflammation. Now, that was a long answer, but the point is that mindfulness is not only working at a mental level, it's having a real physiological effect that's very important for people that have experienced early life adversity. Now, in relationship to the elongation of the exhalation, which is again super easy, the other two practices I feel require a lot more time and effort and fortitude to actually get the mind prepared to do it. So, Ujjayi breath is often translated into English as ocean breathing, although the accurate translation is Victoria's breath. But it should sound like the ocean. I'm just going to come a little bit closer to make sure that it's being picked up by
Yes, please.
your system. So you exhale through the nose like this. And people wonder, how do you make that noise and what is that noise? So, something that probably all of us have done in our daily life is we have fogged up a mirror or a glass trying to clean it, or glasses, right? So, you can, all of you can join me, bring up one of your hands, right? Imagine that it's a mirror, your lovely face is shining back at you. You inhale naturally through the nose, and then just exhale through the mouth. And you want to do this in a slow, controlled way rather than that we sometimes do where we're actually cleaning our
Yeah.
glasses, right? So we'll do that twice more, inhaling naturally through the nose, and then and again inhale, Good. Now, when we do Ujjayi breath, we don't want to do it through the mouth. Ideally, we want to exhale through the nose. And so I'd like you to close your mouth, and I'd like you to imagine that you actually have a nose on your throat. I know that's strange, but I found it's one of the easiest cues to do it effectively. And you can place your first two fingers somewhere in your throat that's comfortable for you. You can actually feel the contact. And you want to start by inhaling naturally through the nose, and then exhaling through the nose and the throat. Inhale. And you can continue to do this in this way for at least 3 minutes. Research does suggest that we need a minimum of 3 minutes, anybody, an absolute minimum, in order to change our physiological state. And that would also have an effect on our psychological state. So, for doing it at the beginning, try to practice it for at least 10 minutes. And you can do it as a way of preparing your nervous system to be slightly more resilient, or as a way to manage psychological overwhelm in the moment. You can even do it when you're with somebody else. As you become more fluent in elongated Ujjayi breath on the exhalation, you can make it very, very low in volume, and almost nobody else will hear you doing it. If you want to know more about how Ujjayi breath specifically affects the nervous system in a way that is potentially more powerful than just slow breathing on its own, you can look at my YouTube channel. I've done lots and lots of free videos on breathing. And if you want to know more about my perception of yoga and mental health, I have co-authored a book on that with Kelly Birch, with various different collaborators. It is literally called Yoga and Mental Health. Or you can do one of our on-demand programs or one of the live ones that we have on the Minded Institute website.
Perfect. Can you share the details? Where can people find out a bit more about you?
So they can go to www.themindedinstitute.com. There's also, as I noted, the Yoga and Healthcare Alliance. But I think if they're looking for support for PTSD and trauma, it's probably the Minded Institute that they want to go to.
Good. Thank you so much, Heather. It's been amazing to chat with you and learn from your life and work experience. Thank you so much for all the wisdom and all the gifts you bring into the world.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.